Imagine hiking through a forest in Kentucky, but instead of a bear crossing your path, it's a millipede, and not the tiny kind. This one is 8 feet long, armored like a tank, and rearing up to look you in the eye. For millions of years, Arthropleura was the absolute king of the undergrowth, a nightmare-sized bug that defied the laws of physics. So how did nature go from producing car-sized insects to the tiny garden pests we have today? The answer lies in a strange atmospheric recipe that Earth has never been able to cook up again. Imagine stepping out of a time machine about 300 million years ago. You've landed in the Carboniferous period, colloquially known as the Age of Bugs. You are standing in what will eventually become Kentucky, but right now it looks more like a flooded, mossy cathedral. There are no birds singing, no flowers blooming, and the air is thick, humid, and heavy. Suddenly, the ferns part. You hear a sound like 100 stiff brooms sweeping concrete. Emerging from the gloom is a creature that defies every instinct you have about how the world works. It's a millipede. But it's not the cute little inch-long wiggle worm you find in your garden. This thing is the size of a crocodile. Meet Arthropleura. Stretching up to 8.5 feet, 2.6 meters long, and nearly 2 feet wide, this creature holds the heavyweight title for the largest land invertebrate to ever walk the earth. To put that in perspective, imagine a smart car, but instead of wheels, it has roughly 60 legs and a heavily armored exoskeleton. If you have a fear of creepy crawlies, this era is quite literally your personal nightmare. For decades, paleontologists have been digging up massive trackways left by these tanks, fossilized tire tracks called diplycnites, suggesting they moved quickly across the forest floor, dodging debris and climbing over fallen logs. It's a weird mental image, a bug so big it could look a German shepherd in the eye. Here's the thing though, despite looking like the ultimate horror movie monster designed to eat your ancestors, Arthropleura was essentially a giant, oversized cow. Scientists still argue whether it was a strict vegetarian or an omnivore that snacked on smaller bugs, but the consensus leans heavily toward it being a detritivore. It likely spent its days peacefully munching on rotting wood and falling leaves, completely indifferent to the terror it would inspire in humans 300 million years later. But how does a peaceful leaf-eater grow to the size of a sedan? To understand why a millipede could grow as long as a limo, we have to look at the invisible soup these creatures were swimming in, the air itself. If you took a deep breath in the Carboniferous period, you might feel a strange buzz. You'd feel incredibly alert, maybe even a bit lightheaded, like you just inhaled pure energy. That's because the atmosphere back then was hyper-oxygenated. Today, the air you're breathing is about 21% oxygen. During the reign of Arthropleura, oxygen levels skyrocketed to roughly 35%. It was basically a planetary hyperbaric chamber. This matters because insects and arthropods don't breathe like we do. They don't have lungs that actively pump air in and out. Instead, they rely on a network of tiny tubes called tracheae that open to the outside world through holes called spiracles. It's a passive system. In our modern, lower oxygen world, this system has a hard limit. If a bug gets too big, the oxygen simply can't diffuse deep enough into its body to reach the center. The bug would suffocate inside its own skin. But with 35% oxygen pushing against those spiracles, the rules of physics bent. The air was so rich that it could travel much further down those tubes, allowing bodies to scale up to monstrous proportions. It was like putting high-octane racing fuel into a go-kart engine. Suddenly, the limitations on performance were removed. Scientists still argue whether this high oxygen was the primary trigger for gigantism or just a supporting factor. but the correlation is undeniable. It wasn't just our millipede friend either. Dragonflies the size of hawks, known as meganeura, patrolled the skies, fueled by this same atmospheric supercharge. But you've been lied to if you think oxygen was the only reason Arthropleura got so huge. There is another piece of the puzzle that often gets left out of the textbooks: the competition, or rather, the lack of it. In the Carboniferous, the ancestors of dinosaurs and mammals were still trying to figure out how to walk without falling over. The largest vertebrates around were clumsy, sprawling amphibians that stuck close to the water. There were no large herbivores to compete with Arthropleura for food. And more importantly, there were no large predators capable of cracking open a 6-foot-long armored tank. The world was an open buffet with no security guards. Arthropleura had the perfect combination of unlimited fuel, oxygen, and zero-stress predators. It was an evolutionary free-for-all, where the only limit was how much you could eat before you had to molt. So, you have a giant bug living in an oxygen-rich paradise, with no natural enemies and an endless supply of rotting plant matter. It sounds like a dynasty that should have lasted forever. But the planet is moody, and it was about to pull the rug out from under the entire ecosystem. Nature, however, had a different design note in mind. History shows us that whenever life gets too comfortable, the planet tends to hit the reset button. For Arthropleura, the end didn't come from a blazing asteroid or a supervolcano eruption. It came from something much slower, much quieter, and arguably much crueler. The weather report changed. About 305 million years ago, the Earth underwent a minor apocalypse known as the Carboniferous Rainforest Collapse, CRC. If you look at the rock layers from this time, you see a stark change. You go from thick black veins of coal, remains of those endless wet swamps, to red sandstone, which indicates dry, arid deserts. The world was heating up and drying out. The vast, continuous blanket of rainforest that covered the equator began to shred. Imagine the Amazon rainforest today, but instead of one giant green mass, picture it breaking apart into thousands of tiny, isolated patches, separated by miles of scorching hot sand dunes. For a creature like Arthropleura, this was catastrophic. Remember, this animal was a specialized machine built for a very specific environment. It needed damp skin to keep from drying out, and it needed those colossal amounts of rotting vegetation to fuel its massive body. As the swamps fragmented, these giants were effectively trapped on biological islands. They couldn't cross the dry seas of sand to get to the next patch of forest. Scientists still argue whether the collapse was triggered primarily by the tectonic plates smashing together to form the supercontinent Pangaea, which creates massive dry zones in the interior, or if it was a result of intense glacial cycles messing with the sea levels. But the effect was the same. The real estate market for giant bugs crashed. Now for the part nobody expects. The rainforests might have actually committed suicide. There is a fascinating theory that the plants themselves triggered this climate disaster. Throughout the Carboniferous period, these colossal trees were sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a record pace to build their trunks. But when they died and fell into the swamp, they didn't decompose. The bacteria and fungi that eat wood hadn't really evolved yet. So, instead of rotting and releasing that CO2 back into the air, the carbon just sat there, turning into peat, and eventually the coal we burn today. By locking away all that carbon, the plants accidentally drained the atmosphere of its greenhouse gases. This caused global temperatures to plummet, leading to ice ages, which locked up water, lowered sea levels, and dried out the swamps. The trees were so good at being trees that they broke the climate system that supported them. This fragmentation led to what ecologists call the island effect. When you trap a population of large animals in a small area, resources get tight. You can't support a herd of 8-foot millipedes in a forest the size of Central Park. The gene pool shrinks, disease spreads faster, and starvation becomes a daily reality. We actually see this in the fossil record, a period called the coal gap. For a few million years, the Earth just stopped making coal because the forests were decimated. The lush, moody cathedrals of moss were replaced by hardy ferns and early conifers that didn't need as much water. The environment Arthropleura was built for, the high oxygen, high humidity, endless buffet, was vanishing. The oxygen level started to dip, slowly but surely, as the plant biomass decreased. The hyperbaric chamber was losing pressure. But even with the air getting thinner and the forests getting smaller, the giant millipede might have been able to hang on a little longer as a smaller version of itself. Unfortunately, just as the walls were closing in, the neighborhood started getting rougher. The era of the peaceful giant was ending, and a new group of hungry, agile upstarts was about to take over the lease. While the forests were shrinking and the air was getting thinner, the neighbors were getting smarter. The Carboniferous period eventually gave way to the Permian, and with it came a biological revolution. The clumsy, water-bound amphibians were being replaced by a sleek new upgrade, the amniotes. These were the ancestors of modern reptiles and mammals. Unlike their slimy predecessors, they had waterproof skin and laid eggs with hard shells, meaning they didn't need a swamp to reproduce. They could follow the receding forests into the drylands, and crucially, they were hungry. For millions of years, Arthropleura had relied on sheer size and thick armor as its primary defense. It was the tank of the undergrowth. But tanks are expensive to maintain, and they are slow. The new Permian predators, like the sail-backed Dimetrodon, were agile, active hunters with increasingly specialized teeth. The evolutionary arms race had shifted from who is the biggest to who is the fastest. This brings us to the Achilles heel of every arthropod, no matter how big: the molt. To grow, Arthropleura had to shed its exoskeleton. Imagine having to strip out of a suit of medieval plate armor every few months, but underneath, your skin is as soft as warm butter. For a creature this size, the molting process would have taken hours, maybe even days, leaving it paralyzed and defenseless. In the old days, with no major predators, this was just an inconvenience. In the new, predator-filled Permian world, it was a death sentence. A soft, 8-foot sausage of protein lying immobile on the forest floor. That's not an animal. That's a free lunch. Scientists still argue whether active predation was the main cause of their decline, or if the reptiles simply ate all the food before the slow-moving millipedes could get to it. It was likely a death by 1,000 cuts. Climate stress, lower oxygen, and aggressive neighbors all squeezing them at once. Here's the thing, though. Arthropleura didn't just vanish overnight. It tried to adapt. The fossil record shows a fascinating trend as we move deeper into the Permian. The millipedes started shrinking. It's a phenomenon called the Lilliput effect. When resources are scarce and predators are large, it pays to be small. Smaller animals need less food, less oxygen, and can hide in smaller holes. Evolution began selecting for the runts of the litter. The massive 8-foot titans died out because they couldn't sustain their caloric needs or hide from predators. But their smaller cousins, the ones the size of a skateboard, then a shoe, then a pencil, survived. They traded dominance for invisibility. By downsizing, they were able to retreat into the leaf litter, escaping the notice of the prowling reptiles. They went from being the lords of the forest floor to the janitors of the soil, a role they still hold today. They didn't really lose the game of evolution, they just changed their strategy from conquer to hide. But even as they shrank, the world was preparing for an even greater catastrophe that would wipe the slate clean for everyone, big and small alike. So why can't we genetically engineer a guard millipede today? If we pumped a greenhouse full of 35% oxygen and threw in some unlimited compost, would Arthropleura return? Physics says no. The ultimate killjoy for giant bugs is the square cube law. As you scale an animal up, its volume and weight grows much faster than its surface area. If you doubled the size of a modern ant, its weight would roughly octuple. For a vertebrate with internal bones, this is manageable. We just grow thicker leg bones. But for an arthropod, the skeleton is on the outside. To support a car-sized body in today's gravity and lower air pressure, the exoskeleton would have to be so thick and heavy that the animal wouldn't be able to move. Arthropleura existed in a brief, magical window of time where atmospheric density and biology shook hands and said, "Let's get weird." Today, the largest millipede is the African giant black millipede, which grows to a distinctively non-terrifying 15 inches, 38 centimeters. Scientists still argue whether these modern species are direct descendants of Arthropleura or distant cousins that evolved from a different lineage. But they do share one nasty trick. While they aren't tanks, many modern millipedes defend themselves by secreting liquid hydrogen cyanide through their pores. They might be small, but they are chemical warfare factories. But you've been lied to if you think oxygen is the only thing keeping them small. Even if we magically fixed the oxygen and gravity issues, the giants wouldn't return. Why? Because birds exist. The niche for large land-dwelling scavenger is currently occupied by mammals and birds that are warm-blooded, faster, and smarter. A giant millipede in the modern world is just a slow-moving buffet for a flock of crows or a coyote. The evolutionary window that opened in the Carboniferous has been slammed shut and bricked over by vertebrates. We live in a world defined by what survived the great filters of history. Arthropleura was a masterpiece of biological engineering, a testament to what life can do when the brakes are taken off. But it was also a product of its time, a specific, unrepeatable chapter in Earth's history. When you see a tiny millipede curled up on your driveway, don't look at it with disgust. Look at it with respect. It is the fallen king of a lost empire, a survivor of the apocalypse that shrank to fit a world that no longer had room for giants. We went from the foggy, high-oxygen swamps of the Carboniferous to the dry deserts of the Permian, tracking the rise and fall of the largest bug to ever walk the earth. We learned that bigger isn't always better, that trees can accidentally freeze the planet, and that sometimes the only way to win the game of life is to get small and hide. If you're glad that the only things the size of cars today are actual cars, hit that subscribe button.